Real plush green lawn here at the beach. I want scrubby little bits of grass that are just barely thriving, some of it half dead, growing here in the sand. So you can see there's not a whole lot of green in this color. So the viewer will get that feeling of relaxed, easygoing feeling that you get at the beach. No need to mow the lawn. Just let the grass do what it does. A little bit of green showing there. Now we've gotten rid of a lot of that pure ochre color that we had down there that was kind of boring. We're getting a little bit more complicated and interesting here. I'm going to put some pure sap green in here, little patches of grass growing. Mixing it right on the canvas. This is going to be so interesting for the viewer to be able to appreciate this painting. They can sit there with a glass of wine, a piece of cheese, admire the painting, and admire each little stroke and all the marbling that went in it. There's so much poetry going on here. Let's put some orange in here. Some of that grass is dead, like weeds. And remember, this is a sunset painting, so that orange sunset is going to hit against some of the shells and gravel and sand and give an orange glow to it. All right, now some yellow. Got to keep this interesting. Some glints of yellow where the sunlight would be hitting here and there. That's really dry grass there. Got some yellow in it. I've mixed up this highlight green. I used some of the green that we were using before. I added some more of that light yellow, and then a lot of that ivory that we had mixed up earlier for the beach, that ivory that was down near the ocean. And then we're going to be adding some seashells into the sand. That's really going to make the sand interesting. There's something about the color pink that makes your heart jump a little bit. It's just a little bit of extra excitement. You usually don't want too much of it. You don't want to be overwhelmed with it, but it's really going to be exciting to have a little bit of pink dancing around in the sand here. So let's put some of this light green in here. Just hop and skip over the texture that you've got going here. We got a little bit of that light green on the palette knife. Hold it really flat next to the canvas and just barely touch it and scrape. Let's get some seashells in here now. Again, we just want a little bit. We're going to tickle the surface just here and there. See how that makes the sand so much more interesting. It's not just blah tan color anymore. Little bit of pink everywhere, kind of like coquina. If you live near the ocean, you hear about coquina. You get it everywhere. And this will just bring to mind, when people are looking at this, they'll start thinking about seashells, little bits and broken pieces. The last thing I want to do to the sand is to take this really big palette knife and just lightly touch over everything with an empty knife. The reason I'm going to do this is that it will blend things a little bit so we won't have such large chunky pieces of paint. We'll have smaller pieces. So it'll look more like broken up pieces of seashells and grass. It'll all be a little bit more cohesive. So see, I'm just barely touching over the surface, just knocking the tips off of some of those highlights that we had. You can probably see how it's just blending everything a little bit, knocking some of those big shapes back into smaller shapes. That makes it look more like sand and pieces of grass, gravel. You get some really interesting marbling when you do this. This is blending paint right on the canvas instead of on the palette knife. And the reason for doing that is to get more variation of color on the canvas. If we blend it on the palette and then put it up here, you're not going to have as much variety. Maybe a little bit of grass growing up there. I'm happy with that. I've got a confession to make. While you guys were away, I worked on the shadows down here under the house a little bit. You can see I've added some purple and blue down there. I did that because the shadow was looking a little bit boring to me. You got to make shadows interesting. A lot of artists think you can just put some purple or blue down there and cover something up and that's got your shadow. But they got to be interesting too if they were going to fall in love with every little bit of piece of this painting. So now with the blue and the purple down here, especially since they're not as dark as the undercoat of the shadow, they glitter like little jewels down there. The other thing is we've brought the blue from the sky down into here. You want to pull all the different elements together a little bit to make this look like a unit. I've already started doing the window panes here. A lot of times window panes on an old house at sunset look like red or orange. They're reflecting the light. The sun's back here hitting this house, and these window panes are really reflecting that orange and flame and red off the sunset. Now I don't want to do all the windows the same color. This one's a cool lavender. Here's a blue. Maybe this window's reflecting the blue sky a little bit at this angle over here. Well, finally it is time to put the yellow siding on this house. This is the main thing we've been wanting to do all along. Getting this bright yellow in here where the sun really hits the side of the house on this side over here. See, when you get in these tight areas, you just got to kind of dance along there. Just touch it and pull up like that, and that'll get you in those tight areas. This is the side of the house where the sun was hitting when we went out and photographed it in the morning. Our photograph actually showed the shadow of a fence right here, but I got the idea that I'd like to put the palm fronds down there in the shadow and let people think there was a palm tree over here throwing it on there. I think that's more romantic, more interesting than a fence. I have filled in the yellow body of the house here and put the roof on. Finally got to use this little knife that I told you I don't use it very much, but I put it in here to get the fronds of that palm tree shadow. This is some tree that's off canvas and the shadows are thrown against the house. Put a little bit up on the roof to make the roof more interesting. You can see we got some rust going on the tin roof there. Got the highlight of yellow on this side where the sun's really hitting that side of the house more. A little bit more golden yellow here. Turns into an orange in the shadow. Made the shadow a little bit more interesting with some pinks and purples in there. Got some more colors going on, keep the motion going in that color. Okay, I've mixed up this ivory paint here. Getting ready to do the mullions on the windows. Spread it out real thin. With a clean knife, pick up a real thin little line of it. Just barely touch it, like that. Clean the knife off, get some new paint on there. Just barely touch it and pick it straight up, and it'll stick. It's hard to make it stick to the paint underneath there. So you got mullions on the windows. Look at this little rick-rack, or whatever they call that stuff on the edge of this handmade wooden awning up here. It's little points of wood that stick down. That gives it the characteristic. I'd like to talk a little bit about using a palette knife. You know, I've spent my entire life illustrating with a brush. I've done a lot of detail with brush, made things look realistic. When you pick up a palette knife, especially after you've been painting all your life with a brush, suddenly you're forced to do things in a more primitive way. You can't do the detail you can with a brush. You can just put these globs of paint on, but there's a benefit to that. The benefit is that it makes things more, brings things more to a primitive level. Things are a little bit more abstract. Now, you know, I've used a lot of art skill here. I've talked a lot about colors and shapes and shadows and blending colors, but because I've handicapped myself with this palette knife, this has brought things down to a more primitive level, a more abstract level. What's really great about that is that the viewer can look at an abstract type painting and it relaxes their brain. They don't have to focus on detail. So their imagination is more free now to come up with their own story. A person can sit here and look at this painting and invent their own details because I haven't filled it in for them. Remember I was telling you earlier that sap green looks good right on the canvas without mixing it with anything? That's because it already has a lot of orange and ochre mixed in with it to make it look natural, unlike a true bright green. So that when you're putting in your foliage in a painting, the sap green is a really good one to start out with for your background base color to get things going with your greenery. Also, I like to start out with a dark background and put lights on top of it and put the highlight so your darkness is in the back where the shadows naturally would be. Putting this dark green on here, filling in big areas. Just want a silhouette of this tree before I put the light on it. Using two palette knives at once. You can use this one here. I told you that was going to be for putting in your palm fronds, so you can get those points there. Living here at the beach, I've had an opportunity to spend a lot of time appreciating palm trees. I especially love to look at them at the sunset time. They reflect so many colors from the sunset. There's a lot of orange and rust and gold in the palm fronds of a tree. You know, when you're a kid, you're coloring a picture, you think, well, palm trees should be green, that's what color they are. But when you're looking at one as an adult, you can appreciate all the different colors in a palm tree. So I've got on my palette knife here some oranges and golds and reds, and I'm going to highlight up this tree here. And it's also going to pull out colors from the rest of the painting. But really, from the sunlight hitting this tree, these colors would naturally be in this palm tree. I want to show you another technique using two palette knives. I've got this little pointy one. It's totally empty, no paint on it. And then I've got this one loaded up with a little bit of orange on there to put an orange highlight. Watch this technique where you can take the empty palette knife and carve in the shape of some palm fronds. Then take your loaded up orange one and just delicately peel over it and see how it pulls out the shape of the palm frond on there. And that tearing of the paint gives a very interesting, realistic texture that you actually find in these palm fronds that get worn out in the wind.